Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cinematic Schematic, the official podcast of the Cinematropolis.com, your home to thoughtful conversations on film. I'm your host, Caleb Masters, and today we'll be stepping into the old Wes Andersonian time machine to sort of a pseudo-imaginary time, back when journalists were once celebrated and magazines were still very much in demand. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Today we'll be discussing The French Dispatch, the acclaimed auteur's latest big screen film. And I'm so thrilled today because we're joined by a first-time guest here on the Cinematic Schematic. I'm thrilled to welcome Jeff Huston from I Can't Unsee That Movie, and also the president of the Oklahoma Film Critics Circle. Jeff, welcome to the Cinematic Schematic.
Caleb, it's great to be here, and it's certainly wonderful to be making my debut with Wes Anderson.
Absolutely. Well, Jeff, whenever it comes to Wes Anderson, I kind of notice I've been following you online here for a few years now, and you definitely gravitate towards the auteurs, and I threw a couple of options out there for you, and you said Wes Anderson. You got me.
Absolutely.
All right, listeners. Well, before we get into today's review discussion, I did want to quickly note that if you are listening to the show today and you enjoyed the conversation between Jeff and myself, I hope you'll consider supporting the show by subscribing to the Cinematic Schematic on your preferred podcast app and leaving us a rating and a review. Preferably, if you're on Apple Podcast in particular, that rating and review really helps us get discovered by more listeners just like you. Now, with that said, let's get to know today's special guest a little bit before we really jump into the meat and potatoes of the discussion. So, Jeff, I'm going to start out with a little icebreaker question. I always like to sort of give listeners a little perspective into what your tastes are. The icebreaker question I have prepared today: you're taken to a mall that is filled with only Wes Anderson approved items. Now, this includes outfits, props, vehicles, maybe even weapons. You can pick anything that you feel like would fit into a Wes Anderson sort of film. So what two items would you choose to buy?
Well, as someone who, I wouldn't even know where to start with props and Wes Anderson. I mean, it's literally infinite when you think about every shot almost, to some degree is packed with props. And it's just that where would you start even in one frame? So I will go with an outfit and a vehicle. And my outfit, it's a close call, but I will take a Team Zissou uniform just barely over a Rushmore school uniform. And then for my vehicle, I will take the car that Owen Wilson drives in the Royal Tenenbaums, the 1964 Austin Healey 3000 Series 3. This little roadster that is just really slick looking. Almost looks like a Bond vehicle in some ways, but more of a twee version of a Bond vehicle, perhaps. But yeah, so it would be a Team Zissou uniform and the car that Owen Wilson drives in Tenenbaums, the 1964 Austin Healey 3000.
And just out of curiosity, what drew you to those two particular items?
It's the first thing I think of. It's the first thing that popped into my mind. I'm just so fascinated with all the varieties of clothes and costuming that appear in Wes Anderson films, and Zissou is one of the most distinct ones. And then, I just always thought that car in particular in Tenenbaums was really cool, and it's something I think of instantly when I think of Tenenbaums, and I just like that car.
Excellent. Well, I can't fault you on the car. It's a pretty neat, nifty little vehicle. Myself, I will actually be taking a pair of skis as seen. It's in the Grand Budapest Hotel. Why?
Yes.
Because I feel like I'm probably horribly inept at skiing, but they make it look so easy in the film. The way they're zigzagging up and down and around the mountain, running away from Willem Dafoe. That's one of my very favorite Wes Anderson chase sequences.
Yeah, they're inherently adept at skiing. So if you're not a skier, maybe it just helps you come more naturally to it.
I mean, I feel like it would help me come as naturally as it does to the characters, right?
Right,
so
right.
Just pick it up and go. And then the other item I would have is one of the scout hats from Moonrise Kingdom. I really enjoyed the whole kind of Boy Scout kind of pack mentality that they had there. Edward Norton being at the helm of that group, I just would like to really have that for an empty little Halloween costume sometime. And actually, fun fact, Moonrise Kingdom was my actually my first Wes Anderson film. So I went and explored his entire catalog after seeing that film.
Hmm.
Gosh, what is it? Eight or so years ago, 7 or 8
Yeah.
years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
Those are my two selections.
Well, that's a great entry point for Wes Anderson for somebody who hasn't seen one of his films before. That's a great one to start with.
Those coming of age stories, they go a long way.
They do. They do.
And getting people pulled in. But listeners, if you enjoyed that little snippet there, what is your favorite Wes Anderson thing? If you could walk into that Wes Anderson store and pick out any two items, it could be something from one of his films or an item that you would imagine in one of his films. You can let us know by hitting us up on Twitter at the Cinematrop. Or going over to Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematropolis and dropping us a comment or message. We can always send your email answers to us at the cinematropolis@gmail.com. Now that you know a little bit more about Jeff and I's taste in Wes Anderson, let's go ahead and get to our review of The French Dispatch.
It began as a holiday. Eager to escape a bright future on the Great Plains, Arthur Howitzer Jr. transformed the series of travelogue columns into The French Dispatch, a factual weekly report on the subjects of world politics, the arts, high and low, and diverse stories of human interest.
You don't think it's almost too seedy this time?
No, I don't.
For decent people.
It's supposed to be charming.
He assembled a team of the best expatriate journalists of his time: Berenson, Sazerac, Kremens, Roebuck Wright. These were his people.
Just try to make it sound like you wrote it that way on purpose.
According to IMDb, The French Dispatch is described as a love letter to journalists set in an outpost of an American newspaper in a fictional 20th century French city that brings to life a collection of stories published in the French Dispatch magazine. So again, we are actually going to be having a spoiler-free review before we get to a more in-depth spoiler section here. So let's going to start with those spoiler-free reactions. Now, Jeff, let's get a little more context here on exactly your relationship is for Wes Anderson. Obviously, you're quite the fan. What would you say is your take on Wes Anderson as a director overall?
Overall, I mean, he's so singular. There's nobody else like him. A little bit later, I will be discussing, some of his influences and giving reference to those. But even when you consider the influences and filmmakers that have influenced his style, he's still made it very singularly his own. And so when you go into a Wes Anderson movie, you're not only going into something that you're not going to see anywhere else, but you know exactly the kind of world you're walking into and that you're entering. And there are some who don't have patience for that, right? They can only take so much. And I'm not one of those people. I can't get enough. So, and I, in particular, am just grateful that he is somebody that leans into, doubles down on exactly what his aesthetic is. He doesn't make apologies for it. If anything, he just keeps going deeper and deeper and making it more dense and more dense with each film. And for anybody that, and you can read them, people who criticize him and think that either he's too self-indulgent, he needs to be reined in a little bit. I couldn't disagree more. I mean, Wes Anderson is the kind of filmmaker that I don't want to put any reins on him. I think because he's so self-assured and so confident in that aesthetic that he plays in and that he's developed and that has grown with each film. And so I don't want him to be reined in. I want him to be free to be in fact, I don't even want him to try something different. Now, if he wants to at some point, if some point in his career he says, I want to try something different, then hey, go be an artist and do that. But if he wants to stay in this world, and what's great about this world that he's in, it's not that it's only one singular world. It's like he goes into different settings, different locations, different times, different places. But then he makes those different times and different places uniquely his own. And so we see, whether it's a boarding school at Rushmore or whether it's a underwater explorer in a submarine and even how that underwater exploration is depicted, vastly different fields and worlds and environments, but each world is a Wes Anderson world.
Yeah, I would actually second that. The thing that I find most compelling about Wes Anderson is how he does have such a distinct style. Like you said, when you watch a Wes Anderson film, you know exactly what sort of trappings, in terms of like the way how the characters are probably going to talk.
Hmm.
That what kind of shots you're probably going to get. Kind of what
Right.
score you're going to get. The thing that I find really compelling about him as a director, though, is while all of that is true, I feel like his style is used uniquely per project. Like whenever he really deploys his style in Grand Budapest Hotel, for example, there's like 3 layers of storytelling going on there, and each one you layer deeper you get, the more like imaginary and more Wes Anderson it gets.
Hmm.
Versus Moonrise Kingdom, where it's sort of instead of like living in the realm of the imaginary, you're seeing it from this is exactly what the world looks like from the perspective of children, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's like the same style, but it means different things in different films. And I'm a lot right there with you. And I want to see more. I want to see him continue to sort of deploy his style on different films and different genres. Because I think there's just a lot of really great stories that only he can tell in that way that come out of it. Out of curiosity, what would you say is your favorite Wes Anderson film?
Favorite Wes Anderson film, for a brief time, it was Moonrise Kingdom. The nostalgia of that, the sentimentality of that, it just, it wins you over. But I would say, as time has passed, I have basically resorted back to what might be considered a cliche choice of being essentially a toss-up between Rushmore and the Royal Tenenbaums. I mean, those are the 2 films that I find myself wanting to watch again the most from his filmography, and the ones I want to keep returning to. Grand Budapest Hotel is also right there for me just because of how extravagant it is, visually speaking. Fantastic Mr. Fox, I have a lot of affection for as well. But in sort of if I could only keep one Wes Anderson movie to take with me to a deserted island, it would have to be Rushmore, even over the Royal Tenenbaums.
All right, so going back to the films that made him a name, so to speak, I definitely respect the sort of the earlier films. Darjeeling Limited is another one that I really like, but I have to say Grand Budapest Hotel is one. The one that you mentioned. Anytime it comes to my attention, like that it's streaming. I have a Criterion copy of it on my
Yep.
shelf. And I think of it. I just say, well, let's just pop it in and watch it. Like it. And I remember there was a while back when I had HBO on cable several years ago, and it was playing on HBO. Anytime I saw it on HBO, I would just watch it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one I think about quite a bit. So that's probably my choice. I love the scope he's working with. I love again the multi-layered storytelling and just how his style's deployed. I like the driving conflict. There's a lot of underlying themes that he doesn't hit too heavily on related to like immigrants, but I do think it's still there and really compelling. So that's when I go back to quite a bit. The other one is Fantastic Mr. Fox, though, and I just love that Wes Anderson is still committed to stop motion animation.
Yes,
Isle of Dogs wasn't my favorite, but it was still a solid movie, and the way he utilized, that specific type of filmmaking and combining it with what some of the more unique like woodblock art we've seen from Japan, I just thought was really compelling overall. So for that reason, Fantastic Mr. Fox just is always going to be holding on there. Anytime I can support stop motion animated films, I'm going to go there. I do have to ask, is there any sort of his isms, so to speak, or any of his style choices that drive you a little crazy, or are you here for all of it?
I'm here for all of it. There really isn't anything about his style that I hate or that rubs me the wrong way. If anything, I've cherished how he's continued to indulge his aesthetic just more and more, further and further, from the symmetry of everything and everything's exactly in its place to his fetishistic attention to detail, all of that increasing with each new film. And as kind of we talked about before, some say, he's too self-indulgent, that he needs to dial himself back to temper his extremes, or they even challenge him to do something different in terms of aesthetic. And I would just hate that. I would loathe that. I will never be able to get enough of Wes just being Wes. And whatever degree he wants to be Wes, I want him to keep doing that. Now, all of that said, if I had to pick a favorite element within his style, whether it be cinematography, and what I mean by that specifically is framing and use of camera, or art direction, or music, or just the general dry comedic tone that's mixed with melancholy that's common to all of his films and certainly reflected in the performances. I had to kind of look at all those and pick which one of those elements of his films is my favorite. I would have to go with art direction. Just the worlds he creates are so singular and so imaginative. I mean, just endless in their Easter eggs. And as I was talking about before, yet he creates these completely different worlds in a singular style in these different times and places. So we can go anywhere at any time in any of his movies. So there's variety in that sense, but it's always going to be him and his those parts of our world in those times through his lens. And the only thing I wish he would branch out and do is live theater. You know, I don't want him to change his aesthetic, but I would love to see him actually work in a live medium. You know, and we get hints of what that would look like from time to time, whether it be in a film like Rushmore or even in French Dispatch, we see some live theater at play and how he puts that together. And when I see stuff like that in his films, I want to see more of it. I would love to see a full-length stage production of Wes Anderson doing his thing.
Man, I think that'd be really great, whether it was like an original project or maybe he did like a one-time run special on one of his favorite films and adapted it for the stage. I think that would be a lot of fun. And you're right, we do see that in the French Dispatch as well. Anytime you have those big shots with the multiple levels, I always think like a stage, you know, where people can climb up ladders, but you can see everything all at the same time. Man, it's good stuff. Now, with that said, listeners, we're going to move into just talk a little bit about the French Dispatch specifically. So Jeff, you are a fan of all things Wes Anderson here. What did you think of the French Dispatch?
I loved that it was, well, first of all, it's an anthology. So there's technically 4 different stories, but there's like a sort of an intro palette setter and then 3 kind of full stories. And I loved that this anthology was entirely his. A lot of times in movie history, when we've seen anthologies made, it's a bunch of different directors coming together and each one just does one short story. And so you kind of hop from one director to the next. And even if they have a similar aesthetic, you're still getting something different each time. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the fact that there's virtue in doing that as well. But I loved staying in the entire authorship of one director in this anthology. And I certainly, it kind of recalls back to the other recent film by the Coen brothers, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. Same thing. Anthology film, but all from the same director. And so I love the aesthetic consistency, the tonal consistency, and the emotional consistency that comes with all of that. And I think he's not just telling 3 different short stories that he pulled off the shelf, but they're all sort of building and crescendoing in this emotional crescendo, certainly to the final piece. And so just the fact that it's an anthology that's all singularly him and not a bunch, just him being one of a few directors putting an anthology together, I really appreciated that. But beyond that, you know, coming out of Cannes this summer, where it premiered, it was described by many critics as being the most Wes Anderson movie ever. And, you know, some used that as a compliment, others used it as a pejorative. And, you know, I'm certainly, count me in the former. I think it's a huge compliment to say this is the most Wes Anderson movie ever. Although, if it is, it's not by much. Somebody could still make an argument that Grand Budapest is the most Wes Anderson movie ever just because of how dense it is. But specifically, and certainly this was happening in Grand Budapest, another really specific thing I like here in French Dispatch is how he creatively uses the old Academy standard ratio, sort of that square framed 4:3 or the 1:3:3:1 ratio. And while he doesn't use that exclusively, he does use some widescreen on occasion. He does use that square frame for most of the film. And while it's not just some random artistic choice just to be different, what I like about his use of that square frame is he packs those frames even more than he might have otherwise with visual content. But because it's this square frame, instead of it feeling cramped, because he's got less side to side to use, he uses depth spectacularly well. And that's something, and he certainly did that in Grand Budapest, but that stuck out to even more to me here, since his left to right is limited. He uses that front to back so intentionally, and so there's a lot of depth to these visuals, and they're just as packed as they would be in a wider frame, but just more front to back. And so I love how he sort of boxed himself in quite literally, but then utilized those constraints in the depth of the visual, and that brings its own sense of riches, and it's really gorgeous.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great examples of that. The one that comes to mind is early in the film. There is one of the short stories in the anthology is covering Owen Wilson as a cyclist, and there's a scene where the town, the city, sort of like awakens, and it's quiet, and all of a sudden the water turns on. The people start opening up shops and everything. But you're right, you see several layers back. There's the pipes, the water, there's your storefronts, then there's the second and third stories, and there's the houses behind him. So yeah, I think that's a really great note regarding the French Dispatch. And I'm glad to hear the anthology worked for you as well. I was a little less warm on it overall. So Jeff, here's my thing with anthology films is 9 times out of 10, not 100% of the time, but 9 times out of 10, anthology, there's usually anywhere from 50 to 75% of the stories that are great, and then the other 25 are less interesting. So I found that to be the case here. Now, that said, because as you pointed out, this is all Wes Anderson's sort of selection, his story, the way the film is structured is similar to like a magazine. They go through this story here, and then we're going to transition to this part of the paper, the magazine, and it's going to be this type of story. I liked the sort of like the setup, the structure. I just was less, and having seen the film twice now, I feel that not all of the stories are quite as strong as the others. And it might just be me, but I inevitably am always comparing. Whenever it's an anthology, I end up comparing like certain chapters. I'm like, well, okay, this is the one I liked less. So I can't wait to get to the next one. Or the first time I was watching the film, I was like, okay, where are we going with this? And then the good news is that the final story, starring Jeffrey Wright, in my opinion, was by far the most compelling, and really made the film for me. So that said, I found the second one, starring Timothée Chalamet and Frances McDormand, to be less compelling than, say, like I said, the last one with Jeffrey Wright, or even the one in the middle with Benicio del Toro. So it's not, it doesn't ruin the movie. I still think overall, the French Dispatch is a really top tier film. It's still Wes Anderson. If you're a Wes Anderson fan, you're going to love it. I would just say overall, I definitely, there were times in the movie, especially the repeat viewing, where I was sort of like, all right, when's the next thing about to happen? Because let's get on to the next thing.
Well, and that's where, for just as a bit of a counterpoint, I really thought that he, for me, built one story after another very well. The order of them and what he was doing in them helped create this building experience that I would, normally appreciate just about a singular story being told. And while each story is different, so, for example, so you get, after you set the world of this French Dispatch and Bill Murray's character being the editor of that and the publisher and setting that world, then you've got this sort of short intro story called The Cycling Reporter that Owen Wilson is telling. And he's giving basically a tour of the city of ennui that the French Dispatch is in. And it's the shortest story. It's brief. And like I said before, it's a palette setter. And so it's just fun. and it brings you into the world. And then that first full story, the concrete masterpiece starring Benicio del Toro, I just thought it was this, the comedy of the piece is superb. Particularly, there's some great physical comedy within this piece, even though, there's interesting things going on with the characters and certainly the story. Just as a piece of physical comedy, some real inspired staging, some live freeze frames, just visually, it's a lot of fun. And then he's also using that to sort of poke holes and make fun of artistic pretense, which is another thing I love broadly about Wes Anderson. He simultaneously sort of basks in artistic pretension just by the nature of his work. But then his work also is always constantly, even in subtle ways or in satirical ways, making fun of artistic pretension and artistically pretentious people. And so that's what the concrete masterpiece is about. Then similarly with Revisions to a Manifesto with Timothée Chalamet, instead of poking holes at artistic pretense, he starts to poke holes at philosophical and political pretense, because it's about the writing of this manifesto and how, in one sense, he genuinely, you get a sense that Wes Anderson loves these youthful socialistic ideals, that are meant to champion the people, and yet he also recognizes the totalitarian impulses that often come from those ideals. And so I just found that to be interesting. So the first main story, he's poking fun at artistic pretense. The second one, philosophical and political pretense, while also still having a genuine affection for those things. But then to your point, it really comes together in a poignant way in that final piece, The Private Dining Room of the Police Commissioner. And not only does it come together in a poignant way, because we're still exploring artistic pretension to some degree, because it's about this, great chef who happened to be a cook for the police. But Jeffrey Wright's character in particular, just as an acting showcase, it's just a great piece for Jeffrey Wright. And even though he's sort of the lead of this one story, I have my fingers crossed that somehow he gets some traction for Best Supporting Actor, because, the guy, he's always deserving of a showcase, and I would love to see him get some awards recognition. And I just think he really shines here. It's clearly written for him. And then his character of Roebuck, who is the writer of this story, and he's the storyteller of this story. Wes Anderson said he's sort of this inspired amalgam of James Baldwin, the iconic civil rights writer and thinker, as well as mixed with one of the most famed journalists of the New Yorker, A.J. Liebling. And I think it's within that within his character, we really get a sense of the affection and sort of the romance of magazines like the New Yorker that Wes Anderson has for that sort of expression, that literary expression. And it just all comes together artistically and emotionally and with sentiment. And I think all those other pieces in a fun way build toward this emotionally resonant final chapter with Jeffrey Wright.
Yeah, I do agree that they sort of build off of one another, which is helpful. And I wholeheartedly second the motion to give Jeffrey Wright an award, because he's spectacular. And I think, listen, people on the internet have been saying this for years. His voice is excellent, and I feel like just having him narrate a picture, like a film, at this level, I think really just sets him up to be sort of the next Morgan Freeman, or
yeah,
his own Morgan Freeman, of course, but he's just got. I want to listen to all the audiobooks narrated by Jeffrey Wright. That's what I'm saying. So.
Well, and he carries that gravitas, but in a very natural way. It's not forced at all, But there's a richness there, and there's you hear a depth there, a depth of humanity. So it's not just the great vocal quality, but there's something behind it, like with Morgan Freeman, where there's a lot of life lived and experienced within that voice.
Most definitely. And also, this is, I would say, clearly the climactic chapter. I mean, there's the most action. We won't spoil it, but Wes Anderson definitely shakes up his form quite a bit for this one, which we'll discuss a little more in spoilers. But overall, this was the most compelling piece for me. And, in classic Wes Anderson form, again, he's like you say, he's both basking in sort of like the artistic expression while also critiquing it. But as the story wraps up, he basically says via one of the characters, well, this is the whole point of the story, in a lot of ways. So overall though, I found it to be a really strong outing for Wes Anderson. I'm going to rewatch it probably many times in the future. So again, we're going to get more into depth in some of the themes here in spoilers, Jeff. But I guess I should just go ahead and leave the question before we move into giving it a letter grade. Was that final vignette? Was that your favorite as well?
It was definitely. It really felt like the payoff to some. I did. In hindsight, I realized it was building towards that. I wasn't thinking that as it was going, but it felt like such an emotional and thematic payoff, and even visually creative payoff. Just everything about it was so satisfying, and the fact that it came at the end as opposed to having that experience up front and then the other two not living up to it. It landed the whole thing.
Excellent. Yes. And again, my favorite was the third vignette as well. The one last thing I'd like to say in the spoiler-free section here about this is this movie does a really great job at showcasing the journalists and what they do to get the story. And each of the journalists has their own approach to getting the story. One of them, it's more of a case study. Whereas another, it's more of a transactional investment in the characters in the story. And then, as we see with Jeffrey Wright, sort of the circumstances are thrust upon him. So I found that also intriguing that each one of the journalists had their own style, and their own level of commitment to what they were trying to tell. And also loved how Bill Murray in a classic publication was this very defensive, protective editor who wasn't afraid to call out his staff when they weren't hitting the mark, but also was fiercely protective of them and supportive of them as well. So anyway, just want to give that last nod. I think that's something the film does very well, is writing a love letter by showcasing people telling the stories. So Jeff, let's go ahead and bring this spoiler-free review home. What letter grade would you give the French Dispatch?
Well, I am such a homer for Wes Anderson that I'm always tempted to just give it some grading of A. But if I have to really, I do feel a responsibility to take a step back and sort of grade some of these on a curve. And so within the whole filmography, I would maybe give it a B plus. Not maybe, yeah, for sure. So there's a handful of his films, or maybe 3 or 4 that are in that A territory if I'm just grading Wes Anderson films. But right below that, I would put French Dispatch.
Excellent. I think B plus is a very fair grade. I'm going to go on the other end of the spectrum myself and say B minus. Again, I also fully expect to in 5 years rewatch this film like 2 or 3 more times and do a total 180 because I have found that Wes Anderson films are very rewarding on repeat viewing, and oftentimes I'm sort of like realigning the order that I enjoy them in myself. But I'd say B minus just because, again, I found the pacing to be good, not great, and mostly because there was one of the stories I was less invested in. That said, you really do need that story for the whole picture to work, the whole thing he's sort of trying to get at to work. So overall, I think it's definitely a winner more than it's not. So I'm going to go with B minus. So listeners, I'd say check it out. If it is playing in a theater near you and you feel safe going into the theater, I do encourage you to check it out. Otherwise, it'll be VOD. The release, the window between theatrical and VOD is not so long much these days. And if you are saying, should I pay $20 to rent it? I'd say you can get a friend to chip in. Absolutely check it out. Now, Jeff, last thing I want to leave listeners with, for those people who do enjoy the French dish, for those listeners who do enjoy the French Dispatch, or maybe they're looking for something that they can sort of compare it to, what is another, whether it's a movie, television show, novel, music, or some other form of media recommendation that you would give listeners today if they enjoy or would like to see The French Dispatch?
Well, as we've discussed, Wes Anderson films are so singular. In one sense, it's hard to find comparisons. It's hard to find what does this match well with? I guess you could start listing in terms of music, just anything that sounds like his soundtracks, 60s and 70s types of songs, or just whimsical sort of orchestrations. But to get specific, I really come back to films. And I'll do kind of two different examples. The first being just the films of Sofia Coppola. I feel like Sofia Coppola and Wes Anderson are really cinematic siblings. I think even though her, aesthetic isn't certainly as dense and even sort of overkill as Wes Anderson's is, their melancholy is very much in tune with each other. And I think that's why, for example, Bill Murray so easily finds a home in both of their filmographies. And so I just think there's kindred spirits working on sort of similar, but yet on unique aesthetic planes. And I think, if you can, it's sort of like, how people pair a wine with a certain food. These are two different things that go well together, even though they bring some different tastes and they complement each other. And so like an Sofia Coppola double feature would always be a great way to spend an afternoon or an evening. And then the other specific reference, also film, is to really dive into the French New Wave of the 1960s. Truffaut, Godard, but most especially Jacques Demy. And even more specifically, Demy's films, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg or The Young Girls of Rochefort. In fact, that second one, The Young Girls of Rochefort, that looks like a Wes Anderson movie. You watch it and you're just like, oh my goodness. This is what Wes Anderson is up to. This is what Anderson's trying to emulate, but that he's also taking to another level. So the films of Jacques Demy and Cherbourg and Rochefort, those two specifically, are definitely ones that if Wes Anderson if Wes Anderson fans have not seen either of those films, check them out.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything French New Wave, listeners, I found myself enlightened anytime I get around to checking out the works from that really powerful era of filmmaking. I am going to go a different direction with this, Jeff. I'm going to focus on other films that celebrate journalism. So, of course, All the President's Men is a really, really big one. I think that just in a lot of ways, again, showcases the job. And there's a lot of noise out there and opinions of a lot of people out there about the role of journalists in society going on right now. But I think if you remove all of that, I love the films that really hone in on the process. What is it like to be a journalist the day to day? What happens when you stumble on a big story? It's not like you just put it out into the world. Like there's historically a lot of work, approvals, ethical questions that are debated about whether or not these big stories get told. So I love All the President's Men because it really hones in on the process and the people that are trying to get the truth out there. The next one I'd recommend is also Spotlight. Similarly, has a stellar cast, won the Oscar, was it 2015, 2014? Correctly, is really one of my favorite films of the last decade. And again, it is about the process. It's the process and the people behind it, and sort of what is it like to have a bombshell, so to speak, story, and what all does it entail to get that published. And again, the answer for those of you who aren't as familiar with journalism, it's not that simple. And I don't know, I just have a thing for watching very competent people be very good at their jobs. I think someone online called it competence porn recently, and I was like, there's something to that. Heist movies, Ocean's 11. Why do you like it? Because those guys are really good at their jobs.
Yeah.
So I want to just give a shout out to those two films, All the President's Men and Spotlight. In particular, but the list goes on. There's a lot of tremendous stories out there about journalism and journalists doing work. And I do think that The French Dispatch, given the fact that it's from Wes Anderson, who has such a distinct style, I think there's a chance this could wind up in that pantheon as well. We'll see. Oscar season's not too far off. All right. Well, listeners, you have our recommendations. You have some additional homework to check out. For those of you who haven't seen The French Dispatch, go ahead and tune out now. And for those of you who have seen it and want to further discussion, hang tight. We'll be right back.
What happened in the end? In the end, they shot him. So it all went to me.
All right, Jeff. So let's go ahead and dive into a more spoiler-filled discussion here. So I've highlighted a few different topics, and as much as we can get to in the next 20 or so minutes, I want to discuss some themes here. And just to segue right on through my alternate media recommendation, I want to start with a tribute to newspapers and journalism. So I just want to get your perspective here. I mean, this film has been touted as, quote unquote, an ode to journalism, a celebration of all the things that goes into newspapers. So from your perspective, in what ways does Anderson really honor the story of journalists in this film?
Well, it's a very specific form of journalism. So this, the French Dispatch is really an ode to the New Yorker magazine and its place in journalism, its iconic place in journalism. And that place has a lot more to do with long form journalism and really diving deep into stories, not just capturing the facts, but capturing the essence, at a storytelling level, not just a reportage level. And so the French Dispatch is really an ode to that specific form of journalism. And then to sort of take that a step further, what I really appreciated about the French Dispatch is that it's a romantic ode to that form of journalism, a tribute not only to a lost style or a style that's becoming lost as time goes on, but more importantly, a lost ethos. And you were kind of hitting on this when you were talking about Bill Murray's editor character a little bit earlier, that ethos that in one sense is both very rigorous in terms of its professionalism, but yet, particularly in this New Yorker style of journalism, this storytelling, it's also an ode to how these journalists took beautiful poetic licenses in the telling of that story, not to such an extreme that it made the stories false, but it brought them alive in a way that only storytelling can. And so there is this professional rigor, but this beautiful poetry being combined into the form of journalism. So you see those virtues at play. You see them being honored here. Certainly from, on the rigor side, Bill Murray's editor and publisher of the French Dispatch. And you were talking about this as well, about that editor. He's not only keeping these writers on task and challenging them to various degrees. So he's reining them in a little bit, but he's also giving them free rein, because ultimately what he's going, whether he's giving them free rein or trying to rein them in certain ways, his goal of doing both of those things is he wants to hear their voices. He wants to publish their voices. And those voices are the voices of reporters and storytellers. And so that's really, I think, what Wes Anderson is paying tribute to and is really in love with.
Right. And again, the idea that the story finds the journalist going back to, the private dining room of the police commissioner, that was supposed to be a story about a meal, essentially, and a chef. It turned into this whole the kidnapping of the son, this huge, sort of swashbuckling adventure that got highly animated. By the way, now we're talking about spoilers, I just have to say that sequence at the end, sort of the chase sequence being animated, was one of the most delightful things I think I've seen in a while. In particular, how they did the whole thing where they all jumped off and on foot ran around the whole bridge and the building and whatnot, and then jumped back in the car. I still, second time I saw it, I lost it the second time. So, but no, I like that it is really, again, like you say, it's following the story and the voices of the writers, letting them sort of run with the stories as they see fit. And I think the aesthetic for each of those different stories by the different authors. So whether it's the cycling reporter, with Owen Wilson, you get the concrete masterpiece, which is following the Benicio del Toro character, or the Visions of a Manifesto. Each one of them has like their own angle and sort of voice to them that I think is just really compelling overall. And like you said in your review, comes together in a complete package, much like a magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like the scene at the beginning when Bill Murray is sort of sitting looking at his board, trying to figure out where to place, everything he's got. I think it really highlights, again, this is more of an art form, I would say, than a normal publication. I'm curious, what do you make of it that Bill Murray's editor character basically positions himself as the newspaper? As in, when he dies, they shut it down. Everyone's well paid, job well done. The obituary will be in the final issue. I don't know. What'd you make of that? I was kind of curious. It's been something that stuck with me, especially the second time.
Yeah, I don't know if this is what Wes meant in terms of how he wrote the character that way to compel him to shut it all down in that sense. But it just makes me think that's just how much ownership Arthur Howitzer is Bill Murray's character's name. That's how much Howitzer took ownership of this piece. Ultimately, even though he is, using a lot of different writers and cartoonists and journalists in these publications, ultimately it's his artistic expression, right? And so he's the author in a maximum sense. And now he's using other authors and other author voices to help create that and to form that. But I think it's an expression of the ownership that he took. And in that way, there's a beauty to that.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, I think with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the second topic here. And this one is the one I'm really excited to get your take on, which is really just, the use of Wes Anderson's visual storytelling, and also the theme of nostalgia, which both of these are elements that I feel like are pretty consistent across his oeuvre. Of course, a common theme, like I said here, in Anderson's film is the nostalgia piece and a fondness for the past. How do you think Anderson explores nostalgia in this film, both visually and in the script?
Well, in terms of the script, the one thing that really sticks out to me is the conversations. It's not, yes, we do see the depiction of how this comes together and how Bill Murray's editor, works with these reporters, but it's the conversations they have. And so his fondness for this form of journalism, we see it being worked out between that editor and those writers. And so the conversations they have about debating what should go in there and what should be changed or adapted, or that's where I feel the fondness really becomes expressed, as well as then just Anderson really finding essentially three different voices within each of those stories. So it's not just a single voice, but there's a definite voice to each of those three, even though it's all told within Wes Anderson's style, which again, as we talked about before, is most effective in Jeffrey Wright's character's voice. So I just think it's in the conversations, it's in the exchanges that we really get the strong sense of what it means. Because when we get a sense of what it means to these characters through their conversations, both the stories they're trying to tell, but how they do it and how they feel compelled to do it and where they differ on that, it's just beautifully done. And then visually, I would really have to see it again and really think about it to really be able to give a straight answer, just because there's so much going on in this film visually, and that's saying something when we're talking about Wes Anderson, because that's a common characteristic, obviously, to all of his films. But, to that comment where a lot of critics have said this is the most Wes Anderson film, there's so much going on. So, I don't know about you, but when I'm watching a film for the first time that I know I'm going to write a review for, I take notes. And watching this movie, I didn't want to glance down to scribble my note for fear of just a frame that I might miss, because there's so much going on visually. It was that sort of an intense level of Wes Anderson aesthetic. And I didn't want to miss a moment because I was afraid I was going to miss something. And and you would. So just in that broad sense, visually, how it reflects sort of the fondness and the nostalgia of the past. Certainly, just the time setting itself, I think, reflects that. The fact that we're going back to early and mid 20th century and working within that general time frame, that's as opposed to modern day. That right there, he's just going back to a fondness of a time, but then even more specifically a place. And the fact that he's still got it connected to Bill Murray's character has his roots in Kansas. And so this idea, the reason that this publisher was in France running the French Dispatch was to send those stories back to Kansas. And so even there, I think that reflects something how the fondness that Wes Anderson has for this kind of journalism is how it opens up the world to its readers. And it's not just giving them information or making them aware of events, but it's broadening their minds. It's broadening how they see the world and how they experience the world. And so even just that little contextual aspect of, this dispatch is to get these reports, not just to fellow French people, but to back into America, into middle America, I thought was very fascinating.
Yeah, most definitely. And I would just say, I think you nailed it with the script, the conversations, the way, the relationships that you have between the writers and the editors, all of that I think checks out. The one thing I'd add on the visual side, which of course is large parts of this movie are in black and white, and we'll talk about the color in a minute. But I did want to note, because I think he is certainly trying to evoke a time of a time long gone whenever it's in black and white. And also the other thing he does later in the film, specifically in the last act, is the use of animation that is very much sort of a nod and tribute to, the sort of covers you would get from the New Yorker, but like in a fully animated form, which I just found to be really compelling. I want to see full-length features, or at least some more YouTube shorts using the same art style there. But again, there's such a level of care that is put into, and thought that's put into all of those different aspects, that I really do think it kind of creates this sort of wouldn't it be cool if we all just lived in this time period? Even the third story, or sorry, the final story, where there's kids getting kidnapped, shootouts happening. That one of the funniest shots in the whole movie is when the police break into the compound and they all have guns pointing everywhere. And, which I'm not a gun guy, but I just found it hilarious. Just the kind of comedic aesthetic of everyone looking for the people in every corner. Wouldn't this be fun if this was kind of how the world we all lived in? It sort of kind of created that, like you said, that romantic edge to the past. It was so much better. Or, it was lighter and sweeter. I just think he kind of creates that imaginary realism really, really well. So let's move on to talk about the color a little bit, because this was probably the thing I'm still, up to this moment, still trying to figure out what Anderson's trying to get at. So I wanted to see if you had any perspective. So there are scenes that are in color in this film outside of the animated sequences, I should note. And one, I think Anderson does a really great job at just sneaking them in. It's pretty seamless. He'll just incorporate a shot that's in color, and then all of a sudden it'll be back in black and white. Whereas it's frequently used to sort of make a statement or be a lot more pointed in the use of black and white to color, black and white to color. Whereas this is very subtle. If you're really in it, you might not even notice it, I would argue. So what did you make of his use of color in this film?
Well, certainly very specific and motivated. So, like you said, by and large, it's a black and white palette. And I agree. I think it's generally speaking, that's a nod to just old journalism. It was in black and white, right? But what I found more interesting as I began to see the moments that he would use flashes of color, I really began to think that what Anderson was doing was this. It was, when he used color, it was his way of crossing that threshold between story and reality. And so when we're in black and white, we're being told the story. But when the flashes of color come in, we're basically crossing that fourth wall to experience the actual reality as those people experienced it. So those moments of color aren't us being told the story or learning it, but we're experiencing how those people experienced it. I mean, you could almost say that the use of color was the film's version of being there. If the black and white was the reporting, then it was as if, oh, this is we're finally capturing what it was to be for that, what it was like for that reporter to be there. And so that's what I think he was using the color for, was to say, this isn't just a story being told, but this is something that happened and that was experienced. And it's the most real, even if it's just emotionally real. It's those moments that he uses color to take us there.
Right. No, I think that's a great read on it. And because I should point out, it's not only the color, even the way the shots are framed are a little differently. The one that sticks out to me is when I believe it's Saoirse Ronan, I think, as one of the prostitutes or showgirls, I should say. The boy says something about the color of her eyes. She asks if her eyes are really blue or something like that. And it cuts to a POV shot of the little boy in the closet, and you can see her eyes.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other shot like that in the rest of the movie. There's no other POV shot where he's using depth and color in that way. And I found that was the sort of the one it really stuck out to me. But you're right. That is the audience in that moment, living in that moment, versus sort of, like you said, crashing that threshold from this sort of imagined, sort of romanticized version of the reporting to the quote unquote real world. Yeah, that's a great read.
Well, and even I don't know if this is universal to every shot of color, but quite often when he used color, he would also go from the square frame to the widescreen frame. Yep. So in that sense, he was also opening the world just in terms of the frame as well as the color. And so that just emphasized even more, oh, this isn't just the story we're being told. Just for this brief moment, we're experiencing it like these people that we're being told about, how they experienced it and how they felt. And that shot of Saoirse Ronan's eyes, I think, is a perfect example of that.
Right. All right. Well, that's a great read. So, of course, listeners, I don't know. I saw a lot of people online talking about that exact thing. So I think it's a great read. And honestly, that's what's beautiful about sort of how ambiguous he leaves that. When I go back and watch the film again, I'll have a new lens to check it out. And it'll mean something a little different. So that's pretty exciting there. Let's talk about, I just wanted to quickly touch on the animated sequences. I've already sort of shared my love and affection for those. Jeff, what did you make of these?
Well, maybe in the strictest sense, they're a stylistic gimmick, but I don't necessarily think that makes them bad or superfluous, because I think specifically the reason that they're there is because, again, referring back to the New Yorker, which is really the inspiration for the French Dispatch. I mean, it had, it didn't just have essays and feature stories and reporting. It had cartoons as well, and does have cartoons. And so these animated sequences are essentially a representation of that aspect of the publication, of the fact that cartoons are a regular part of this sort of magazine. But I also think, to go back to this conversation we just had about the use of color, if the use of color was taking us from the reporting to the reality of these moments, I think the use of the animation is the other opposite extreme of that. So if color represented the most real and true moments of these stories, then the animation could be seen as the most fantastical licenses and the most fantastical flourishes that these reporters took when telling their stories. And as you were describing earlier about that whole, chase sequence, I mean, that's a great example of that, is you get a sense that, okay, it probably didn't really happen this way, but the license is the most, or the biggest licenses are being taken in those animated sequences. And so I think that's very intentional as well.
Yeah, great nod. I'm sure the strong man landed on his feet. Exactly. Right. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and move on to our final topic here today. And it's a nod to immigrants. So a key moment in the final vignette, the private dining room of the police commissioner, reveals that the chef tasted something that he'd never tasted before. To which Jeffrey Wright, the character Roebuck Wright, again, I like the inspiration there. They both have the same last name. So Roebuck Wright responds by posing sort of a question. This is not verbatim. I failed to get the verbatim response in my second viewing. But perhaps the gist is perhaps we can find the thing that we longed for in our home elsewhere. And then Howitzer responds by saying, well, this is the reason for the reason the story was written. You have to include it in the story. To which, Roebuck Wright disagrees, but then includes it in the story. So Jeff, I want to turn it to you because there's been a lot of nods to immigrants and immigrants' stories throughout Anderson's body of work, even if it's not usually front and center quite. But I did find this inclusion interesting. So what was your take?
Well, I don't know if I have a take per se on the specificity of immigrants. But here is what those things make me think of. Those lines that you were quoting specifically, here's what it comes to my mind. Wes Anderson is a native Texan. And if his films were your only reference for him, the last place you would probably guess that Wes Anderson hails from is Texas. Nothing about his movies say Texas, right? His sensibilities are clearly boldly, excessively European. So when Anderson writes a sentiment like the ones you just quoted, like the chef's saying, tasted something he'd never tasted before, or the other one you noted, perhaps we can find the thing we longed for in our home elsewhere. I think Anderson is talking about himself ultimately, about his own experience of, and certainly films do that for us, and certainly traveling does that for us. But for him, it was probably in literature first, and maybe even reporting and storytelling first. And so when we think about this in the context of immigrants, this isn't a dogmatic statement by Anderson. He's not trying to say something directly. I think it's a personal one. I think it's a testimonial for him. And it comes from a place of gratitude of what other places, other people, other cultures have brought to him. And so, in one sense, he delves into all that, some people would say in a very pretentious way, but he's also, taking pot shots at that pretense. And and so within all this pretense, there's still this remnant of him being a Texan at his core. And so even though he's very European in his style, and he found this home in other cultures where, that he longed for, he found it elsewhere outside of Texas. I still think when he's taking pot shots at some of the pretense that is very identifiable as European, I think that's still the remnant of his Texan inside of him. Sort of this humility that he grew up with, that people shouldn't get too big for their own britches or whatever, And so, so he's ultimately grateful that he was looking for a home as a Texan, but there's still some of that Texan left in him, and it comes in how he tells his stories. And so all of that is sort of what I think of when I see those statements that you really honed in on.
Well, and I think just to sort of echo that point, the idea that the stories told in these magazines could really help the readers sort of fulfill that growth. You know what I mean? Maybe the readers, like you said, this is a magazine that they are writing in France so that they can send it back to Kansas. Mm-hmm. So maybe in a lot of ways that's the him saying via the film as well. Hey, like these stories, hopefully you're finding something in them that you're lacking in your everyday life. Or maybe it sort of helps change your perspective in much the same way that film can do, as you pointed out as well. I like that read quite a bit. And again, it's one of those, I like the really highly personalized touch that you brought to the table, because I really feel like when he's frequently sort of like nodding to immigrants in his films without going too in depth, but I hadn't even considered it because he is a man who certainly doesn't fit the profile of a Texan. For sure.
Yeah. Well, and even just, to really hone in on that idea of what is this saying about immigrants, as you're talking and the more I think about it, I mean, that's ultimately what stories do, right? They connect us, or part of what their power can be is connecting us with people that we've never met before, that we don't know. And it's that first, almost more inviting way to get to know them for the first time and to start breaking down prejudices and start showing us, oh, they're more like me than I realized by just, hearing this story and seeing these people and their experiences. Yeah, I'm sort of like them too. And those stories are sort of that easier way for us to ease into the breaking down of prejudices and breaking down those barriers that otherwise might separate us.
Absolutely. And it brings us to put a pin in the conversation, brings me to one of my favorite Roger Ebert quotes, talking about film as a machine that generates empathy so that we can learn more about the people that we're walking through life with. So anyway, anytime I can bring it back to Roger Ebert, I feel like there is that sort of loose connection there. The powers of stories to help us empathize, to learn, to grow, and to ultimately become, hopefully, have some humility to our fellow man. So all of that packed into one little moment of a Wes Anderson movie. But I'm glad we dove into that, because the movie does call out, via Bill Murray's editor, this is the reason the story was written. I really felt like he was sort of signaling to the audience at that point, this is kind of the point. if not for that final vignette, the whole film. And I wanted to dive into that for listeners. Well, Jeff, I think we are about out of time, but I did want to leave you with an opportunity. Is there anything else you would like to say about the French Dispatch before we close out today's show?
Two things. One, Tilda Swinton. Yes. She's the storyteller of the first story, and her character is so uniquely bizarre and is in itself this embodiment of both satirizing and having affection for people in the realm of artistic pretense and high society. And just her take on that character is comically brilliant. But then more deeply, I came across just yesterday, there was a tweet by Richard Brody. And Richard Brody is the film critic for The New Yorker since 1999, so a little over 20 years, and author of books like Everything is Cinema, The Working Life of Jean-Luc Godard. So when you're talking about film critic for The New Yorker, writing a cinema book about Jean-Luc Godard, I mean, this is somebody who can really speak well to Wes Anderson. And so in this tweet, and it's just like a 3-tweet thread I want to read, because for me, he really starts to hit at what is really effective about Wes Anderson and what some people and what his critics often get wrong about him. So anyway, I'll read it here. He says, Wes Anderson's films baffle many otherwise astute critics because they're inescapably, essentially, for interpretation. Despite the sensory and narrative overload, nothing is literal or realistic. Everything is symbolic and demands imaginative sympathy to get anything at all from it. The films can't be consumed or watched on one's own terms. Substance and style can't be separated. I really love that little bit right there. Substance and style can't be separated. One of the knee-jerk critiques of Wes Anderson is that he's style over substance. I can think of people like, for example, I read somebody writing about how they didn't like Grand Budapest Hotel because they thought it was just this whole fascination with production design, and it didn't have the emotional depth of Moonrise Kingdom. And what Brody's saying here basically is you can't separate those two. And so, to the degree that Wes Anderson is excessively stylistic, he's doing it all for a purpose, and you can't dismiss it alone as just style over substance. They're all integrated. And so he basically ends his tweeting by saying, instead of just passing these things off as empty, we have to figure out what they embody and why do they take that form. And that's how you really start to engage a filmmaker like Wes Anderson. Why is he this way? And I do believe it's something more, and there's something richer and deeper than just the fact that he has a fascination with detail and symmetry, and he's more fascinated than just wanting to, have his little dioramas and treat actors like figurines and all that sort of thing. He's still getting at emotions and sentiments and ideals that are very meaningful to him. And just because, and there's sort of this weird contrast where his visual style is so rich, but then his tone is so dry. But then how that comes to, and I think it's those two things, the richness of the visual experience and the dryness of his tone, and that's what creates melancholy. And and he is this melancholy spirit, and his characters have this melancholy spirit. And all of that comes together, from the visual to the tonal, to create that unique experience. And that's why, quite honestly, I'm moved by each of his films in various ways. I don't find them cold and distant and just artifice like a lot of people do. I connect with them emotionally because I really feel like there's emotional investment in every aspect of his filmmaking.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually feel like his films are deeply emotional. Sometimes by saying less, you're saying more. And I think a lot of it goes back to what I mentioned at the top of my review. He has a very distinct style that maybe not everyone likes, but I do think the way in which he deploys it differently in each story, the way he frames it via certain character POVs, is really, really, really where the meaning and like the emotion is at. Because you have to stop and think, I'm watching or reading the story from this character's point of view. Why are they thinking about it why does the world look this way to those characters? What does that mean to them? And I just think there's a lot there on Anderson film, and I think he's very clever and specific on what stories he chooses to tell using that style. So well said, Jeff.
Yeah, and you get so wrapped up in the whimsy that then as a director, he'll take you to these points where, the whimsy stops. And now we're having basically a real moment with these characters. And that happens in each of his films. And so he's using all of that artifice to, in one sense, entertain you, but also distract you. But then that when he brings the reality of those emotions and those ideas in, he really knows how to drop them in, again, in this melancholy way that makes them resonant.
Awesome. Well said. Ladies and gentlemen, that will be our full review of The French Dispatch. Jeff, we're going to close out the show here, but for listeners who enjoyed hearing your analysis and your review of The French Dispatch, where can they keep up with you and your work online?
Yeah, so my website is ican'tunseethatmovie.com. Again, it's ican'tunseethatmovie.com. And then my Twitter handle is @can'tunseemovie.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, you want to keep up with all the things at the Cinematropolis. As I noted earlier, you can head over and catch us on Twitter at the Cinematrop or on Facebook at facebook.com/the Cinematropolis. You can also find me tweeting about all sorts of things related to film, television, and video games over on Twitter at CMastersTalk. That's letter C, Masters Talk. Thanks so much to everyone for tuning in today. We'll catch you again next time.